The air inside the county courthouse felt heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Dusty light filtered through tall windows, slicing into the room in uneven beams that revealed the faintest shimmer of particles floating in the air. 100 eyes, maybe more, were trained on the smallest figure in the room, a little girl seated in the witness stand. She was no older than 7. Her hair was pulled into a crooked ponytail, the kind of style only a rushed adult could have managed that morning. She clutched a teddy bear so tight that its faded brown fur seemed to bristle in protest. Her feet dangled far above the polished wooden floor, swinging nervously, tapping an invisible rhythm only she could hear. The courtroom wasn't used to silence lasting this long. Usually it was filled with the sound of lawyers objecting, papers shuffling, bailiffs calling for order. But now it was different. Every cough, every shift of a chair, every whispered breath was an intrusion into the stillness. It was as though the whole town had come to witness this case, filling the gallery with neighbors, acquaintances, and strangers who wanted to see what would happen when innocence was placed under oath. The judge, a woman seasoned by decades of listening to lies, truths, and everything in between, leaned forward ever so slightly. Her gavel rested quietly by her side. She knew moments like this were fragile. Push too hard, and a child could retreat into silence. Push too little, and the truth might never surface. The little girl blinked up at the judge, her eyes wide, too large for her small face. She didn't fully understand why she was here, not really. She only knew the rules had changed. At home, she had learned not to speak about certain things, learned to smile when she didn't want to, learned that grown-ups could be scary when they wanted to be. But here, they told her she had to talk, and that everyone would be listening. From the front row, her mother's presence anchored her. The woman sat with hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white, her face pale and tired. She offered a small smile whenever the child glanced her way, but it was a fragile smile, one that could break at any moment. The mother had been told not to mouth words, not to nod, not to guide the testimony in any way. So she sat motionless, praying silently that her daughter's courage would hold. On the opposite side, her father sat tall and composed, his sharp suit catching the light. He exuded confidence, as if this was merely a formality, a performance he had already won. To him, this courtroom was just another stage, no different from the boardrooms where he controlled outcomes with charm and money. His attorney had told him repeatedly, appearances mattered, and he was certain his appearance was flawless. He believed his daughter wouldn't dare say anything against him, not here, not in public, not in front of strangers. But for once, he wasn't smiling. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing whenever the little girl looked toward her mother instead of him. He tapped a single finger against his knee, a steady rhythm that only he seemed to notice. The bailiff shifted his weight, clearing his throat softly, but even that small sound felt like a disturbance. Everyone's focus returned immediately to the child. The prosecutor, a woman with kind eyes but a steady voice, stepped forward slowly. She had spent weeks preparing for this, carefully planning her questions to be as gentle as possible, mindful of the fragile balance between clarity and pressure. She knelt slightly, lowering herself to the child's level without stepping too close. "Hi, sweetie," she began softly, her voice a low murmur that carried none the less in the silence. "Do you remember me? We talked a few days ago in my office, remember?" The girl nodded once, her teddy bear shifting in her arms. "Good," the prosecutor said with a small smile. "And do you remember how I told you we'd come here today, and you'd get to help everyone understand things better?" Another nod. A quick one this time. The prosecutor's heart clenched, but she kept her expression calm. She knew this child's testimony could turn the entire case upside down. The father had painted himself as a loving, responsible parent. The mother had been depicted as weak, emotional, incapable. But the truth didn't live in polished statements. It lived in this little girl's trembling voice. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. She gave the faintest nod, allowing the questioning to proceed. The first few questions were easy ones. What was her name? How old was she? Did she know why she was here? The girl answered softly, each word barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to reach the farthest corners of the courtroom. The jury leaned in, straining to catch every syllable. Then the questions grew a little heavier. Did she love her daddy? The girl nodded. Did she love her mommy? She nodded again. Her answers seemed safe, balanced, designed to keep the peace. The prosecutor knew this was common children, caught between two worlds, often tried to please both. But it was the next question that shifted the air in the room. And tell me, the prosecutor said gently, her eyes never leaving the child's, when you feel scared, who do you go to? The little girl froze. Her teddy bear was nearly crushed in her arms as she lowered her gaze to her lap. For a moment, she didn't move at all, and the silence deepened into something unbearable. Her father's attorney shifted in his chair, preparing to object, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. She wanted to hear the answer. A girl opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced quickly at her father, then just as quickly at her mother. Her legs swung nervously, hitting the wooden witness box with a soft thud. And then finally she spoke. Her voice was so small, so quiet, that the court reporter leaned forward to catch it. I don't know, she whispered. But her eyes betrayed her. They flickered toward her mother, desperate, pleading. The judge saw it. The prosecutor saw it. Even the jurors saw it. And for the first time that morning, the father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was dangerous. It was the kind of silence that threatened to rip apart carefully crafted lies. The kind of silence that carried more truth than 100 polished statements. The little girl's words had been vague, almost evasive, but the look in her eyes told a different story. And though no one in the courtroom could quite explain why, every single person knew something was about to change. The father sat straight-backed in the courtroom, his suit jacket pressed smooth, his tie neatly knotted, every detail carefully curated to send a single message: control. He had rehearsed this posture, this expression, in front of mirrors, in boardrooms, even in front of his lawyer. Every gesture was deliberate. He wanted the jury, the judge, and anyone watching to see the image of a capable man, a stable provider, a father who had everything under control. He exuded confidence, though inside there was more calculation than calm. His sharp jaw was clenched just enough to suggest seriousness, but not anger. His hands rested on the table, palms down, as if to project honesty. He leaned slightly toward his lawyer, nodding along with whatever whispered advice was offered, but never too eagerly. He had mastered the performance of sincerity. To the townspeople watching, it was convincing. Many of them knew him by reputation. He was a businessman who owned half a dozen properties around town. A man who donated to charity, who appeared at church fundraisers with a smile, whose money carried weight in places money wasn't supposed to matter. People said he was charming, generous, respectable. Few dared question whether the charm was a mask. But his daughter knew better. From the witness stand, she dared a glance in his direction. His lips stretched into what others might mistake for a reassuring smile. She recognized it for what it was, a warning. It was the smile he wore at home when guests were present, the smile that disappeared the moment the door shut and the voices faded. She gripped her teddy bear tighter. His lawyer rose and straightened his jacket, turning toward the little girl with a smile that mimicked kindness. His tone softened, but his questions were sharp beneath the surface. "Sweetheart," he said. "You love your daddy very much, don't you?" The girl's throat tightened. She nodded, her voice too small to be heard. "Yes," the lawyer pressed. "You've always said you love being with your father. He takes care of you, doesn't he?" The nod came slower this time. The father leaned back slightly, satisfied. To him, this was proof. He believed the courtroom belonged to him, that the truth could be bent by appearances and rehearsed gestures. He believed that a child's voice could be guided, if not silenced. His confidence wasn't just in his lawyer's skill. It came from years of shaping narratives. At work, he had learned to bury mistakes under polished reports. At home, he had learned to bury fear under silence. And in court, he intended to bury his past under a mountain of charm. But the cracks were already showing. The judge, though expressionless, watched him closely. She noted the subtle shifts in his posture, the way he glanced at his daughter as if checking her answers, the faint smirk that followed every word in his favor. She had seen men like him before, polished, persuasive, dripping with confidence. She had learned long ago that confidence in a courtroom could be both armor and weapon. But sometimes it was camouflage. His attorney continued, "And you've said before that your father always makes sure you have food and toys, right?" The girl's voice wavered. Yes, the answer was correct on the surface. He did buy her things. Toys, clothes, shiny distractions. But the little girl knew that gifts sometimes came with shadows. They came after arguments, after long nights of yelling. They were peace offerings, apologies without words. The jury, however, didn't know that yet. They only saw a well-dressed man nodding quietly, seemingly proud of his daughter's answers. To them, he looked like a man trying to win back his child, not a man trying to bury her voice. The mother sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands gripping the tissue in her lap. She knew this part of the trial would be difficult. The father had money, polish, presence. She had none of those things. She only had truth. And truth, she feared, sometimes wasn't loud enough in rooms like this. Her lawyer scribbled notes furiously, preparing questions, but his pen shook slightly. He knew the danger of allowing the father's narrative to take root. Once jurors believed in the father's perfection, it would take a mountain of evidence to tear it down. Still, the father looked perfectly at ease. The prosecutor asked for permission to redirect, her voice calm but firm. The judge granted it with a nod. The prosecutor crouched slightly, meeting the little girl's eyes once more. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "you said you love your daddy very much. That's a good thing. It's okay to love both your parents. But let me ask you something different. When you feel sad, who do you go to?" The little girl froze. Her father shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening for the first time. The courtroom seemed to contract around her, pressing closer, demanding an answer. She looked down at her teddy bear, then at her hands, and finally up at her mother. The father's lawyer objected leading question, but the judge overruled him. The girl's lips parted, and though her voice was faint, the words carried enough weight to cut through the father's armor of confidence. "Mom." The word was soft, nearly lost in the air, but it was enough. The jury stirred, the mother closed her eyes in relief, and the father's smile faltered ever so slightly. The father leaned toward his attorney, whispering sharply, his mask of composure slipping at the edges. The attorney nodded quickly, shuffling papers, already preparing the next move. But the shift was undeniable. The judge, watching closely, marked the father's reaction more than the girl's answer. For the first time that day, the man who had entered the courtroom certain of his victory looked unsettled. His confidence cracked, if only by a hairline fracture. It wasn't the verdict yet. It wasn't even the damning evidence that would come later. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, the judge knew, often told the ending. The father straightened again, forcing the smile back onto his face, determined to regain the performance. But in that fleeting moment, when his daughter had chosen one word over another, the courtroom had seen something he could not fully control. Confidence, no matter how polished, had limits. And a child's truth had just pushed against them. The silence that followed was no longer in his favor. The mother sat at the long wooden table, her chair feeling much too large, the room much too cold. Her lawyer had told her to sit still, to remain calm, to never let the jury see her nerves. But how could she hide them when her hands trembled with every breath? A crumpled tissue was balled tightly in her fist, damp at the edges, evidence of the tears she had already shed that morning in the courthouse bathroom. She wasn't a woman of means. She didn't have the kind of money her ex-husband flaunted. No polished suits, no high-profile attorneys, no curated image to impress the court. What she had was the weight of years of surviving nights, filled with arguments, of covering her daughter's ears, of trying to shield innocence from shadows. She carried those scars into the courtroom, though no one else could see them. Her ex-husband's lawyer had painted her as fragile, unstable. Words like emotional and weak had been used against her, as though caring too much were a flaw. She sat there, hearing those words echoing, but forced herself to keep her chin lifted. She would not let them break her here. She looked at her daughter, perched in the witness stand, clutching that old teddy bear. Every instinct screamed to run forward, to scoop her into her arms, to promise her it would be okay. But she couldn't. The court had rules, invisible walls between mother and child. She had to sit, to wait, to trust that her daughter's truth would be enough. The prosecutor's earlier questions had given her hope. One small word Mom had slipped past her ex-husband's mask of perfection. The jury had noticed. She saw the flicker in their eyes, the small shift in their posture. It wasn't enough to win yet, but it was something. It was a crack in the walls her ex-husband had built. Still, fear gnawed at her. She knew how convincing he could be. She had lived under the spell of his charm once. When they first met, he had seemed perfect, generous, attentive, ambitious. He bought her flowers, took her to expensive dinners, whispered promises of a future filled with love and stability. For a while she believed it. For a while she was happy. But then came the changes. The subtle criticisms disguised as jokes. The questions about where she was going, who she was with, why she hadn't answered his calls fast enough. The first slammed door. The first long silence stretched out like punishment. The first night she realized she was afraid to say the wrong thing. By the time their daughter was born, the man she had fallen in love with felt like a stranger. He was still charming in public, still the perfect father at family gatherings, but behind closed doors, the mask slipped. His anger was quiet, controlled, but sharp enough to wound without leaving marks. His words cut deeper than fists ever could, and his silence was worse than both. She had stayed longer than she wanted to admit. She stayed because she believed the promises when he swore he would change, because she wanted her daughter to have a father, because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed until the day her daughter's tiny voice asked her, "Why are you sad, Mommy?" That was the moment she realized she couldn't keep pretending. And now, here she was, sitting across from him in a courtroom, fighting for the one thing that mattered more than anything else, her child's safety. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering that her turn to testify would come soon. She nodded, though her stomach twisted with dread. She wasn't good with words. She wasn't trained to spar in court the way her ex-husband was. He had a way of twisting stories, of making lies sound prettier than the truth. She feared that, under cross-examination, she would stumble, falter, cry, and the jury would see weakness, not sincerity. But she reminded herself, Weakness and strength weren't opposites. Sometimes being strong meant crying anyway. Sometimes it meant standing in front of the world with every flaw visible, refusing to back down. She pressed the tissue to her lips, inhaled shakily, and fixed her gaze on her daughter again. The child glanced at her, eyes wide, searching. Their connection was wordless, but it was real. Her daughter knew her mother's love. She knew her mother's arms were safety, her mother's voice was comfort, her mother's presence was the anchor in every storm. The mother thought of the nights when her daughter had crept into her bed after nightmares, whispering, "Don't tell Daddy." She thought of the mornings when she had packed school lunches while swallowing her own tears, forcing smiles so her little girl could leave the house with joy instead of fear. She thought of every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, every time she had chosen her daughter over herself. She clung to those memories like armor. Her ex-husband's attorney rose again, striding confidently toward the witness stand, firing off questions that were clearly designed to confuse, to trap, to make the little girl second-guess herself. "Your father gives you toys, doesn't he? He buys you nice things?" "Yes. And he takes you places, fun trips? Vacations?" "Yes. So you like spending time with him, don't you?" The girl hesitated. Her small voice came out shaky. "Sometimes." The attorney's smile flickered, just for a second, before he recovered. The mother's chest ached. She wanted to scream, to stand up and say that toys and vacations didn't erase fear, that children could love and fear someone at the same time, that love didn't always mean safety. But she stayed silent, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles burned. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying the child, studying the father. Her expression gave nothing away, but the mother sensed something shifting. The father still looked confident, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. His jaw tightened when his daughter hesitated. His polished mask was strong, but not unbreakable. And the mother, fragile though she appeared, realized she wasn't as powerless as she felt. She didn't need a perfect lawyer, or polished clothes, or wealth to fight this battle. She had her daughter's trust. She had the truth. And sometimes, truth had a way of cutting through even the most carefully built lies. The mother sat straighter in her chair, tissue still clutched in her hand, but her chin lifted now. She wasn't here to prove she was perfect. She was here to prove she would never stop fighting for her child. And as the little girl's trembling voice filled the courtroom again, the mother knew this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for her daughter's future. And she would not lose. Judge Margaret Ellison sat high on the bench, her black robe draped heavily across her shoulders, a symbol of authority that she carried with equal parts pride and burden. To most people in the courtroom, she was an unshakable figure, calm, composed, unreadable. But beneath the stillness of her face was a mind that rarely rested. She had been on the bench for 22 years. She had seen almost every kind of case murder trials that rattled entire towns, property disputes that turned neighbors into enemies, and custody battles like this one that carried wounds invisible to the eye. Yet each case felt different because each family carried its own secrets. She had learned long ago that appearances lied. Men with perfect suits could carry the darkest shadows. Women who looked fragile could be the strongest survivors. Children could carry truths heavier than any adult should ever ask of them. Today, she felt the weight of that last truth most of all. From her vantage point, she studied the little girl sitting in the witness box. The child's feet swung nervously, her teddy bear clutched tight, her voice barely above a whisper whenever she answered questions. Margaret's heart ached, though she never allowed her face to reveal it. She had a soft spot for children. She always had. But she had also learned that softness, if not guarded, could be dangerous in the courtroom. Her job wasn't to protect feelings, it was to protect justice. And justice demanded careful listening, sharper than any blade. She had watched the father closely from the moment he walked in. His confidence was loud, even when he was silent. The way he carried himself, the way he exchanged glances with his attorney, the way he smiled only when his daughter seemed to answer in his favor, it was all a performance. Margaret had seen performances before, some brilliant enough to fool juries, some sloppy enough to crumble under cross-examination. She wasn't fooled. But she also knew that truth had to be more than instinct. It had to be proven. She turned her gaze to the mother. The woman's hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. She sat quietly, speaking only when required. But Margaret had noticed the way she looked at her daughter, an unspoken connection, raw and unpolished, but real. It reminded Margaret of her own daughter, now grown, who used to look at her the same way when she was small, with trust, with safety, with the belief that a mother could hold back the storms of the world. Margaret kept her face neutral, but inside, she felt the stirrings of something she often reminded herself to suppress. Empathy. Empathy was important, yes, but empathy could cloud judgment if it wasn't tempered with caution. She reminded herself of her duty, to weigh evidence, not emotions. Still, the evidence was slowly being shaped not just by facts, but by the fragile words of a child. "Proceed," she told the attorneys, her voice firm but even. The father's lawyer rose again, adjusting his tie, his confidence sharp. He asked leading questions, painting the father as a provider, a man who bought toys, who took trips, who gave his daughter everything a child could want. Margaret let him continue, but she took notes quick, precise, scribbled in her neat handwriting. Material wealth versus emotional safety. It was a balance she knew the jury would need to consider. Then the prosecutor rose for redirect. Her voice was soft, but her words cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. "When you feel scared, who do you go to?" she asked the little girl. Margaret leaned forward ever so slightly, her pen hovering above the page. The girl hesitated, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. She glanced at her father, then at her mother, then down at her bear. Silence stretched, fragile as glass. And then soft, barely audible came the answer. "Mom." The word was quiet, but it reverberated through the room. Margaret saw the mother's lips tremble, saw the father's jaw tighten. She felt the jury stir, felt the air shift. Her pen touched paper. Child identifies mother as source of safety. But Margaret didn't let herself react beyond the note. One word wasn't enough to decide a case. She knew how dangerous it could be to jump to conclusions. Children could be influenced. They could be pressured. They could speak truths, yes, but they could also speak what they believed adults wanted to hear. She studied the girl again, her wide eyes, the way her voice had trembled but hadn't broken. Margaret leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable, but her mind racing. There was something in the child's hesitation, something in the way her gaze had lingered on her mother before the answer came. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't prompted. It was instinct. Margaret trusted instinct in children more than she did in adults. Adults could manipulate. Children simply revealed. Still, she reminded herself, caution. She addressed the child directly, her voice calm, steady, but not unkind. "Sweetheart," she said, "you're doing a very good job. You're being very brave. Remember, you don't have to rush. Just tell the truth, in your own words. That's all we need from you." The little girl nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. Margaret shifted her gaze to the attorneys. "Continue." But as questioning went on, Margaret's mind drifted not away from the case, but deeper into it. She thought of the custody battles she had presided over in the past, of the countless parents who used their children as pawns, as weapons, as shields. She thought of the children who had been too scared to speak, and of the ones who had spoken truth so simple they shattered facades in an instant. She remembered one case, years ago, where a little boy had stood on the witness stand and said, "I don't like when Daddy drinks." That single sentence had unraveled months of testimony, exposing abuse no one had dared put into words. She wondered if this case would follow the same path. The father's lawyer attempted to regain control, throwing out objections, asking carefully worded questions to guide the narrative back to his favor. Margaret allowed him the space, because fairness demanded it, but she watched his client closely. The father's mask was cracking. Every time his daughter hesitated, his jaw flexed. Every time her answers leaned toward her mother, his confidence faltered. Margaret wrote in her notes, "Father reactive to child's answers. Observe closely." The jury shifted in their seats again. She didn't need to read their minds to know what they were thinking. They were weighing what they saw: a confident man with wealth and polish, and a trembling woman with nothing but love and truth. Which held more weight? Which was more trustworthy? Margaret knew the answer, but it wasn't her role to impose it. She had to wait. She had to let the truth unravel on its own, thread by thread, until the pattern was undeniable. And so she waited. Her caution wasn't weakness, it was discipline. She would not allow herself to be swayed by a single moment, no matter how powerful. But deep inside, a part of her already knew. The case was shifting. Slowly, quietly, like a tide rolling in, inevitable and unstoppable. The gavel rested by her hand, heavy and still. She hadn't touched it once that morning. But she knew by the end of this trial, when it came down with finality, it wouldn't just echo against wood. It would echo in the lives of everyone in this room. Most of all, the small girl with the teddy bear. Judge Margaret Ellison folded her hands, keeping her expression unreadable, but her mind sharp. Caution, she reminded herself. Always caution. Because in the end, 2 words could change everything. And she suspected those words were coming soon. The little girl's small fingers dug into the fur of her teddy bear until the seam stretched, the old stitching threatening to tear. The bear had been with her since she was 2 years old, its left ear chewed away, its fur thinned by years of holding it through storms, both real and imagined. To her, it wasn't just a toy, it was a shield, the only piece of home she trusted to follow her into this foreign, terrifying room. The prosecutor crouched down just far enough to meet the child's eyes, careful not to tower over her. "You're doing such a good job," she said softly. "Take your time. There's no rush." The girl nodded, but her throat felt tight. The words lodged like stones she couldn't quite swallow. She could hear the faint hum of the lights above, the shuffle of someone's foot against the courtroom floor, the sound of her father's breath behind her. He always breathed loud when he was angry, and though he was silent now, she swore she could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Sweetheart, remember, you're not in trouble. You're just here to help us understand. You only have to tell the truth." The girl's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked at her father. His smile stretched across his face like a mask, but she knew that smile too well. It wasn't the happy kind. It was the be careful kind. The kind he wore at dinner parties, when guests asked questions that got too close to secrets. Then she turned her eyes to her mother. Her mother didn't smile. She didn't mouth words. She just sat there, tears balanced on her lashes, her hands clutching a tissue like it was the last rope tethering her to hope. The girl felt a jolt of something she couldn't name courage, maybe just from knowing her mother was in the room. The prosecutor's voice cut softly through the tension. "Can you tell me, sweetheart, do you love your daddy?" The girl nodded, her voice a whisper. "Yes, And do you love your mommy? Another nod. Yes. A murmur rose in the gallery, faint but noticeable. Some people shifted uncomfortably, perhaps relieved by the simplicity of her answers, perhaps frustrated by them. To love both parents seemed safe, neutral, but everyone in the room knew the question wasn't about love. It was about trust. The prosecutor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Then she asked the question that had hovered like smoke since the trial began. And when you feel scared, or sad, or unsure, who do you feel safest with? The room froze. The little girl's chest rose and fell quickly, her small lungs fighting for air that seemed too heavy. She clutched her bear tighter, so tight that the button eye pressed painfully against her palm. Her father's gaze burned into her, invisible but sharp, as though his eyes carried the same command he always used at home. Don't you dare. Her feet swung nervously above the floor. She bit her lip, and for a long moment, silence thickened around her, so absolute that even the air felt unwilling to move. She thought of the nights when the house felt too loud, when doors slammed and voices roared. She thought of the cold silence after arguments, the kind that lasted for days and made her feel invisible. She thought of the footsteps in the hallway that made her hide under the covers, holding her bear so tight it hurt. And then she thought of her mother, of soft arms wrapping around her, of whispered stories in the dark, of gentle hands stroking her hair until sleep came. She thought of safety not as a word, but as a feeling, one that only existed when her mother was near. Her lips trembled. She closed her eyes. And finally she whispered, "Mom." The sound was fragile, nearly lost in the silence, but it carried like thunder. The courtroom stirred. A woman in the gallery pressed a hand to her mouth. One of the jurors shifted forward, pen frozen above paper. The prosecutor gave the faintest nod, her eyes soft with encouragement. The father's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "The child is clearly being coached and overruled," Judge Ellison said sharply, her gavel still resting, but her tone firm. "The witness may continue." The father's jaw flexed, his smile faltering at the edges. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, but the damage had already been done. The prosecutor lowered her voice again. "And why do you feel safest with your mom, sweetheart?" The little girl swallowed hard, her small shoulders trembling. Because Mom knows." The words slipped out before she could stop them, small but sharp, like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples were immediate. Gasps filled the courtroom. Someone in the gallery whispered, "What does she mean?" Judge Ellison's pen scratched quickly across her notepad. "Mom knows." The prosecutor tilted her head gently. "Can you tell us what you mean by that? What does Mommy know?" But the girl shook her head fiercely, burying her face against the worn fur of her teddy bear. "She just knows." Her voice cracked on the last word. Tears spilled down her mother's cheeks. She pressed her tissue hard against her mouth to stifle the sob building in her chest. She knew what her daughter meant. She knew all too well. The father sat rigid, his composure cracking, his confident facade collapsing in slow, visible fragments. His lawyer put a steadying hand on his arm, whispering something urgent, but his eyes never left his daughter. For the first time, there was no smile, only fury, barely contained. The judge let the silence settle before speaking, her tone calm but commanding. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're very brave. That will be all for now." The bailiff moved closer, ready to escort the child from the stand. She climbed down carefully, her teddy bear dragging across the polished wood, her small body shaking from the weight of words she didn't fully understand. But everyone else understood. 2 words, Mom knows, had cracked open the shell of the father's carefully crafted image. They carried the weight of unspoken truths of fear hidden in shadows, of safety found in the only person who had ever protected her without condition. As the little girl returned to her mother's side, burying herself in the safety of familiar arms, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Some looked at the father with new suspicion. Others looked at the mother with quiet sympathy. And the jury scribbled furiously in their notes, the meaning of those two words lodging deep in their minds. Judge Ellison rapped her gavel once, restoring order. But inside, even she knew, the case had shifted. Those two words would not be forgotten. And though the trial was far from over, the little girl had spoken the truth that mattered most. The truth no one could unhear. The silence after the child's whisper lingered like smoke trapped in the rafters. Mom knows. 2 words. Soft, almost fragile. And yet, they had slammed into the courtroom with the force of a hammer against glass. Nothing shattered physically, but the air itself had fractured. Every person in the room felt it, the jury leaning forward as though gravity itself had pulled them closer, the gallery buzzing with muffled gasps, the lawyers scrambling to recover their footing. Judge Ellison raised her gavel and tapped once, restoring a brittle order. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were sharp. The witness is excused. The little girl was guided back to her seat beside her mother. She nestled into her mother's arms, clutching the teddy bear so tightly that its stuffing bulged. The mother held her close, her tears spilling freely now, not with weakness, but with a release of years of bottled fear. She kissed the crown of her daughter's hair, whispering words no one else could hear. Across the courtroom, the father sat stiff, his face stripped of its practiced charm. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes dark, his jaw tense enough to crack a tooth. For weeks, he had worn the mask of a confident parent wronged by a bitter spouse. But masks are fragile things, and nothing peeled them away faster than the voice of a child. Mom knows. The words echoed like a bell in every corner of the courtroom. They didn't say much. They weren't an accusation, but their weight was undeniable. They implied something hidden, something unsaid, something only the child and her mother shared. The prosecutor sensed it too. She stood slowly, walking a deliberate pace before the jury. Her voice was calm, but edged with significance. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard it. 2 words. 2 words from the only voice in this trial that truly has no agenda this child. Children don't calculate. They don't perform. They don't spin stories to protect reputations or financial assets. They speak from instinct, from truth. And what did this little girl tell us? She told us her safety, her comfort, her trust lies with her mother. The father's lawyer shot up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making a speech during testimony. Sustained, Judge Ellison said, though her eyes betrayed no annoyance. The jury will disregard counsel's commentary for now. Continue within the bounds of questioning. The prosecutor nodded, but the seed had been planted. The jury wouldn't forget. They couldn't. The father's lawyer tried to claw back control. He rose with a veneer of calm that didn't reach his eyes. Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to recall the father to the stand to address this matter directly. The judge allowed it, and the father swaggered back up, though the swagger had a hollow echo now. He sat, raised his right hand, swore the oath again, and clasped his fingers together like a man holding himself together with sheer force. Mr. Warren, his lawyer began, you've just heard your daughter say her mother knows. In your view, what could she have meant by that? The father chuckled, though it rang false, brittle. She's a little girl. She's just nervous. Kids say things that don't mean much all the time. Mom knows probably means her mom knows her bedtime routine, knows what she eats, knows the little details. That's what mothers do, right? He smiled, trying to seem natural, but the room didn't buy it. The jurors scribbled, their eyes unblinking. The prosecutor rose for cross-examination. Mr. Warren, you suggest your daughter's words meant nothing more than bedtime routines and favorite foods. But isn't it true, sir, that your daughter hesitated before answering? Isn't it true that she looked directly at you, and then at her mother, as if weighing fear against safety? The father shifted in his chair. She's shy. That's all. You're twisting things. Am I? The prosecutor pressed, her tone sharpening. Or is it possible that the child meant something deeper? Something she's too afraid to say outright? Something only her mother has acknowledged? Objection. The defense lawyer shouted. Speculation. Overruled, Judge Ellison said after a pause. The question goes to credibility. The witness may answer. The father's confidence faltered. He shifted again, his eyes flickering to the jury. I can't speak for what a child means in every word. But I know she loves me. I know I provide for her. I give her everything she could want. Everything. The prosecutor interrupted. Except a sense of safety? The father's mouth snapped shut. His jaw flexed. The silence that followed was louder than any denial. The prosecutor stepped back, satisfied. The father looked smaller, and when he had first taken the stand, his edges dulled by the weight of his daughter's fragile truth. The judge called for a brief recess. As the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted into a storm of murmurs. Reporters scribbled in notepads. Spectators whispered theories. Jurors exchanged glances heavy with unspoken conclusions. But in the center of it all, two people clung to each other, the mother and her child. The little girl, her face hidden in her mother's blouse, whispered again, though this time only for her mother's ears. I was scared, Mommy, but I told them. I told them, you know. Her mother stroked her hair, holding back sobs. You did so good, baby. You were so brave. Nobody can take that away from you. Those words, overheard by no one else, carried the same weight as the two that had stunned the courtroom. They were the heart of it all, the bond between a child and the parent who truly saw her, truly protected her. The father sat at his table, his hands clenched into fists. His lawyer whispered furiously, but he didn't seem to hear. All he could see was the jury, their pens scratching, their faces unreadable, their thoughts now infected with suspicion he couldn't scrub away. When court resumed, the judge looked directly at the jury, her voice calm but heavy with significance. Members of the jury, you are reminded to focus not only on what is said, but on how it is said. Tone, hesitation, body language all are part of testimony. Words matter, yes, but so does the weight behind them. The jurors nodded solemnly. They understood. They had heard the two words. They had seen the hesitation. They had felt the weight. And though trials are built on evidence, documents, and sworn testimony, everyone in that room knew that sometimes it was the smallest voices that told the largest truths. Two words, simple, unpolished, unrehearsed, but those two words had cracked open the case. For weeks, the mother had sat quietly in her chair, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, her voice used sparingly, and only when called upon. To most in the courtroom, she seemed fragile, timid, almost broken. That was the image the father's attorney wanted to cultivate, the picture of a woman too weak to raise a child alone, too unstable to provide structure. But all of that changed the moment her daughter whispered two words, Mom knows. Those words did more than tilt the balance of the trial. They unlocked something inside the mother that had long been buried beneath fear. She had endured years of intimidation, manipulation, and the silent kind of cruelty that left no bruises but carved deep scars. She had lived in the shadows of his control, doubting herself, shrinking so her daughter might stay shielded. But when her little girl had found the courage to speak, something shifted. It was as though her daughter had passed her a torch in the darkness, one she could no longer refuse to carry. When court reconvened after recess, the prosecutor stood. The state would like to call Mrs. Warren back to the stand. The mother rose slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt. Her legs trembled at first, but with each step toward the witness stand, they steadied. She raised her hand for the oath, her voice clear as she swore to tell the truth. Then she sat, folded her hands in her lap, and took a deep breath. The prosecutor approached with care. "Mrs. Warren, we've heard testimony today from your daughter, testimony that was brief but powerful. I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak to the court, not only about your daughter's words, but about your own experiences. Tell us, in your own words, what you believe she meant when she said, 'Mom knows.'" The mother's eyes flickered to her daughter, who was seated at the table with the victim's advocate. The child clutched her teddy bear, her eyes wide, watching her mother with a mixture of hope and fear. The mother straightened her back. "She meant," the mother began, her voice steady, "that I know what happens when the doors are closed and no one else is watching." A ripple of sound swept through the courtroom, hushed but undeniable. The father's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation." "Overruled," Judge Ellison said firmly. Her gaze fell on the witness. "Proceed, but keep your statements to your direct knowledge, Mrs. Warren." The mother nodded, her fingers tightening briefly before she released them. "I know the nights when my daughter cries herself to sleep because the house is too loud. I know the mornings when she's afraid to ask simple questions because of the way he might answer. I know the way she flinches when footsteps come down the hallway. And I know because I lived it too." Her voice cracked, but only for a moment. She drew in a breath, and when she spoke again, her tone carried steel. "For years, I stayed quiet. I thought if I endured it, if I carried it all, she might be spared. But children see more than we want them to. They feel everything, and she felt it all." The prosecutor gave her space, letting her words settle. The jury watched intently, pens scratching across paper. Some jurors' expressions softened, others hardened, but all of them leaned in closer. The father shifted angrily at his table, whispering furiously to his attorney. His face had reddened, his jaw tight. But the mother didn't look at him. For the first time, she wasn't speaking with him in mind. She was speaking for her daughter. "Mrs. Warren," the prosecutor asked gently, "why didn't you speak up sooner?" The mother closed her eyes briefly, gathering courage. "Because I was afraid. Not of losing custody, not even of losing myself. I was afraid of what he'd do if I tried. He's a man who wears charm like armor. Out there," she gestured vaguely toward the world beyond the courtroom. "He's the father who takes her to piano recitals, who buys her toys, who tells everyone how much he adores her. But behind closed doors, the mask slips. And I was terrified that no one would believe me, that my voice would sound weak compared to his confidence. So I stayed, and I prayed. But when my daughter looked at me today, when she said those words, I knew silence was no longer an option." For the first time, tears streamed openly down her face, not tears of fear, but of release. The prosecutor's voice softened. "And do you believe your daughter is safe in his care?" The courtroom stilled. The question hung heavy in the air. The mother straightened her back, her eyes hardening with resolve. "No, I do not," gasps echoed faintly. The father's attorney shot to his feet again. "Objection. Purely subjective, emotionally charged. Overruled." Judge Ellison cut him off sharply. "The witness is allowed to answer the question." The mother's eyes flicked once more to her daughter. The girl's small hands gripped her teddy bear tighter, her eyes glistening, but her shoulders seemed to ease, as though a weight had been lifted. She wasn't alone anymore. Her mother had taken the torch and held it high, The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. When the defense lawyer rose for cross-examination, the mother braced herself. He paced deliberately, his voice dripping with practiced skepticism. Mrs. Warren, isn't it true that you're painting this picture now out of desperation because you fear losing custody? The mother met his gaze squarely. No, I'm painting this picture because it's the truth. You have no police reports, no hospital records, no documented evidence of abuse. Isn't that correct? That's correct, she admitted, her tone unwavering. Because the abuse I'm describing doesn't leave bruises you can photograph. It leaves scars you can't see. It leaves fear in a child's eyes. The lawyer smirked, trying to puncture her resolve. So all we have is your word? The mother leaned forward slightly. And hers, she said, nodding toward her daughter. The defense lawyer hesitated. His next words faltered. The weight of the little girl's testimony, and the strength of her mother's hung in the room like a truth too heavy to ignore. Judge Ellison finally intervened, her tone calm but decisive. That's enough for now. The jury will have plenty to consider. The mother was dismissed from the stand. As she walked back, her daughter rushed into her arms, wrapping tiny fingers around her. The embrace wasn't silent, it was a declaration. The two of them, fragile but fierce, standing together in front of the world. For the first time in the entire trial, the mother didn't sit small and quiet in her chair. She sat upright, her daughter against her side, her eyes fixed forward. The woman who had been painted as weak had revealed her strength, not through anger or theatrics, but through truth spoken plainly, courageously, and the jury saw it. They had witnessed the transformation. They had seen the mask slip from the father and the steel rise in the mother. They had heard the child's words, and now they had felt the mother's. The tide had turned. The courtroom had never felt so heavy. Not even during the most brutal testimony, not during the sharpest cross-examinations, had the air carried this kind of stillness. It was the stillness before a storm breaks, the kind that makes the heart thrum louder than footsteps, louder than whispered breaths. 12 jurors filed back into their seats. Their faces were masks of solemnity, yet behind those masks flickered the weight of everything they had seen, heard, and felt. They had listened to lawyers spar like duelists, watched a child struggle to whisper truths, witnessed a mother transform from fragile to fierce. Now their judgment would not only shape the fate of the parents, but determine the future of a little girl, whose teddy bear had seen more tears than any adult should know. Judge Ellison entered last, her black robe trailing like a shadow. She sat high on the bench, her gavel resting in her palm for a brief moment before she set it down. She had seen verdicts delivered for decades, but even her chest carried a heaviness today. This wasn't just about legal custody. This was about truth, the kind that rarely makes its way cleanly into the light. All rise, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing. The room stood. Be seated, the judge ordered calmly, and the benches creaked as bodies settled back into place. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had not missed a single detail, stood as Judge Ellison addressed her. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. A shiver ran through the gallery. Even the reporters, pens poised, seemed to hesitate before scratching at their notepads. Please deliver the verdict, Judge Ellison said. The foreperson unfolded the paper in her hands. The silence was so thick it could have smothered a whisper. In the matter of custody of minor child L.U., she read, her voice steady, we, the jury, find that it is in the best interest of the child that custody be awarded to the mother. Mrs. Warren. The mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears rushed to her eyes, but this time they were tears of release, of victory, of relief so profound it left her trembling. Beside her, her daughter buried her face into her side, clutching her blouse with one hand and the teddy bear with the other. The father's jaw clenched. His face turned red, then pale, his composure cracking fully now. He muttered something harsh under his breath to his attorney, his hands tightening into fists against the polished wood of the table. The confident mask he had worn for so long shattered under the weight of a single word, verdict. Judge Ellison lifted her gavel. The jury's decision is accepted. Custody of the minor child is hereby awarded to the mother. Visitation rights will be subject to further evaluation. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed louder than any before. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators sighed with relief. Others whispered rapidly, voices overlapping like a current of shock and emotion. The reporters' pens flew, eager to capture the headline. 2 words from Child's Way custody battle. But in the center of the storm, the mother held her daughter, rocking her gently, whispering, "It's over, baby. You're safe now. We're safe." Judge Ellison lingered a moment on the bench, her eyes briefly softening as she watched the embrace. She had seen victories before, but this one carried a weight she couldn't shake. She thought of her earlier caution, her reminders to herself not to be swayed by emotion. Yet in the end, it wasn't emotion that had tipped the scales. It was truth. A truth so small and simple it fit into 2 words. Mom knows. She gathered her notes, closed her folder, and rose, her robe sweeping silently behind her as she left the bench. She knew this case would stay with her. Not because it was high profile, not because reporters would talk about it, but because of the small girl with the teddy bear and the courage to speak what she felt in her bones. At the counsel tables, the father remained seated, his lawyer's hand gripping his shoulder, whispering urgently. But he didn't hear. His eyes were fixed on the mother and child, walking out of the courtroom together, hand in hand, stronger than they had walked in. His empire of confidence had crumbled, undone by the smallest voice in the room. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was filled with flashing cameras, murmured questions, the chaos of public curiosity. But the mother shielded her daughter, guiding her quickly past the noise. With every step away from that room, she felt years of fear peeling away like an old skin. The weight didn't vanish, it never would, but it became lighter with each stride. "Mom?" The little girl whispered as they stepped into the sunlight filtering through tall courthouse windows. "Yes, baby? You believe me, right? You believe I was brave?" The mother knelt down, tears glistening but her voice strong. "I've always believed you, and you were braver than anyone I've ever known." The girl smiled, the first genuine smile since the trial had begun, and tucked her head against her mother's shoulder. A teddy bear dangled at her side, worn but triumphant. Behind them, reporters shouted questions. "Do you feel justice was served? What do you think about the father's reaction? What happens next?" The mother didn't answer. Some truths didn't need microphones. Some victories didn't need headlines. The only audience that mattered was the little girl in her arms. As they stepped outside, the autumn air hit their faces, crisp and cool. The courthouse loomed behind them, but for the first time in years, the mother didn't feel small beneath its shadow. She felt tall, steady, unshakable. A verdict wasn't just a legal decision. It was a declaration. That truth, however fragile, however whispered, had power. That the courage of a child could move the hearts of 12 strangers. That the quiet strength of a mother could rise from silence and shield her child in ways no court could ever legislate. And so they walked forward, hand in hand, toward a future not free of challenges, but free of fear. 2 words had changed everything. 2 words had set them free.